Well, good morning. We're tackling the problem of evil today. And I say that with great fear and trepidation because this is not an easy topic. This is something that was hard to put together, realizing that I'm just scratching the surface of this issue. People have wrestled with this for thousands of years. There's no way we're going to get this all solved in one day, but at least it's a starting point. It's something we begin thinking about, something we carry home with us, something that we think about during the week. Maybe we do some more reading, but at least this is a starting point. So maybe you've seen some headlines like these in the newspaper. Awful things. You turn to the front page these days and you just cringe. You know you're going to see something awful there. Problems in the Middle East, starvation someplace else, riots in another area of the world. Here at home, we're not free of these things. There's evil all around us. Sometimes it strikes very close to us. Sometimes it's in our city. Sometimes it's a national problem. And certainly we can find it all over the world, can't we, if we take a look at headlines like some of these. And here's the problem. If we had to put it in a nutshell, if we had to put it in a single sentence, you probably know where I'm going with this. If there's a good God, and that's what Christians believe, and other religious groups, but we're thinking about Christians today. We say there's a good God out there. Well, of course, the answer, the challenge is, really? Well, if there's a good God, ... and you know where I'm going with this. If there's a good God, how can there be this much evil? Why are children starving? Why are those wars going on over there? Why are all of these events happening that looks like a world out of control? It looks like chaos and terrible things everywhere. And these are some of the answers that people have given over the years. Some say, well, there is no God. And we're going to take a look at that in just a minute. That's one answer. In fact, a lot of people have been turned off to the idea of God because of evil. Many people have walked away. So we'll come back to that in just a second. What about this answer? Well, you think it's evil, it's just an illusion. Sometimes it's called Maya. It's an Eastern religious idea. You just think it's a problem. You just think it's evil. This is a New Age solution as well. You just think it. You have to change your thought processes. There's no such thing as evil. God is in everything. If God's in everything, there really can't be any evil. It's a misunderstanding. It's an illusion. Here's a third one. He would like to help. God really cares for us, and He grieves when we grieve, and He's wounded when we're wounded. But He doesn't have total power. And there was a book some time ago called When Bad Things Happen to Good People by a rabbi, a Jewish rabbi. And he lost his son at an early age, and he struggled with this. He said, I don't know. And he worked and he thought and he prayed, and this was his answer, that there is a God. So he reaffirms that there is a God, but He's not as powerful as you would think. And so bad things happen, and he feels bad for us, but he can't fix it. Here's a last answer. He's not all good. What do you mean God's good? This might be the answer Islam and other groups might bring forth. What do you mean God's good? He's Allah. He is separate from us. He's a pretty tough God. He can change. There's that thing called abrogation. He can change His mind. You're kind of on shaky grounds there. Allah does not love. He's not a God of love. He's a God that weighs you pretty tightly at the end of time. So these are at least some other answers here. Let's go back to that one I mentioned about, well, what about those who say there is no God? Well, here's the poster boy for atheism. His name is Richard Dawkins. Professor at Oxford, has umpty-ump degrees after his name. Now, I wanted to share with you his response and see how you feel about this as you consider the terrible things, as you open up your newspaper, or you look at your magazines, or you just talk to your neighbors and talk to people at work. Here's what Richard Dawkins says. In a universe of blind physical forces and genetic replication, some people are going to get hurt, and other people are going to get lucky, and you won't find any rhyme or reason to it, nor any justice. The universe we observe has precisely the properties we should expect if there is at the bottom no design, no purpose, no evil, and no good. Nothing but blind, pitiless indifference. DNA neither knows nor cares. DNA just is, and we dance to its music. Well, that's an answer, isn't it? I find it really chilling, but that is an answer. So, think of somebody like Adolf Hitler. I would think, and I bet all of you think, what he did was evil. He took out homosexuals, he took out gypsies, he took out those that were physically limited, and he certainly took out as many Jews as he could. Something like 6 million people perished under his regime. But according to Richard Dawkins, that wasn't really evil. Hitler was just dancing to his DNA. So we shouldn't call it evil. He just had some bad DNA. Not really his fault. There's no such thing as evil. Then you got Mother Teresa as an opposite. She goes and she sacrifices her life for the untouchables in India. Now, is she doing something good? Well, wait a minute. Richard Dawkins says at the bottom, there is no evil and there's no good. She's dancing to her DNA. And we're all dancing to our DNA. So maybe that'll let us off. Next time we get arrested, we can go to the judge and say, hey, sorry, judge, DNA just is. I'm just dancing to its music. No, I don't think that's going to go over, do you? But that is an answer. That's what we hear from the atheist. There is no good or evil. Of course, then we might say to an atheist, well, then do you really think there is something that's evil, or it's just something you personally don't like? If you buy into the Dawkins theory, remember, there is no good, there is no evil at the bottom of things, then you just have to say, well, what Hitler did was something that I didn't like. No, I think all of us, down deep in our gut here, we know that what Hitler did was evil. So I think this answer that Dawkins gave us doesn't make any sense. There is something out there. For example, torturing babies for fun. That's evil. It's always going to be evil. Taking advantage of the weak. Deceiving honest people for your own gain. There's a lot of things out there that we say, that's evil. But not according to the atheists. So we might pin somebody down. If they complain about racism, or if they complain about sexism, or if they complain about people that destroyed the environment, we have to say, wait a minute, time out. You don't think there's any good or evil, so you mean you just don't like it. Well, watch what answer you get. They're going to step back and say, no, it's not that I don't like it, it's wrong, and they're going to use that word wrong. That just destroyed atheism. They must not really be an atheist, because if you're an atheist, there is no wrong and there is no right. It's just whatever is, it's just DNA dancing to its music. Something else we might say to an atheist. All right, you don't believe there's a God. Let's take God out of the picture. How in the world does that solve the problem of evil? The answer is, you still have the evil. So this doesn't solve anything to say, let's get rid of God. Okay, you get rid of God, you still have dying children, you still have warfare, you still have the strong preying on the weak. That didn't solve anything to get rid of God in that equation. How about this one? There's a famous story of an atheist who said to a Christian one time, you Christians, you'd come alongside the bed of a dying child. What are you going to say? That's evil, that's wrong. Well, why can't we turn the question right around and say to the atheist, well, what would you say at the bedside of a dying child? You'd look down and you'd say, I'm sorry, you just didn't get a good break in life. You'd look at the parents and say, you better hold this child as long as you can, because he or she will go in the ground, and then that's going to be it. Now, if you put a Christian there, could the Christian offer hope? Oh, yes. Tell the parents, you and the child will be reunited someday. Tell the child, this is not the end. God's going to embrace you, and you're going to have a new life free of pain and suffering. So that's just something to think about. So what's the Christian response to all these issues about evil? Well, Christianity predicts something called evil. So when somebody says to you as a Christian, how can you have a God if there's evil? We would say, no. Christianity, by its record in the Old Testament and the New Testament and what Jesus said, we know there's evil because we know the human heart is broken. We know God has set up certain commandments, and people, because of our brokenness, we break those all the time. That's sin. That's evil. That's coming short of the glory of God. So it's not that we run from evil. It's not that we're surprised by evil. Christians say, yeah, obviously there's evil. That was what happened once we walked away from God, clear back in Genesis. But here's the good news. Now, we'll be touching on this more than once today. Christianity, unlike these other beliefs, has a cure for evil. So we recognize it, we're realistic, and we say there is a cure for it as well. Well, let's take a look at some answers. I'm going to divide them into two types of answers as far as how in the world can you say there's a God and then have all this evil in the world. So first, let's start with philosophical answers. In other words, you're not in pain and suffering, your friend's not in pain and suffering, and so you just sit down and you just have an interesting philosophical conversation. So we're going to do those kinds of responses first. But there may be the time where you or a friend or a worker, co-worker, a fellow student, somebody is really suffering. And you sit down with that person, they probably do not want philosophical answers. So there's a time and a place for the philosophy. Instead, you may want to give them solid, emotionally powerful reasons for the existence of evil. So let's start first with the philosophical answers. Let me read something to you here from the book of Job. The Lord answered Job. Let me kind of back up here. The story of Job involves this righteous man, and Satan mocks him and says, he's only good because you've been good to him, he says to God. And God says, I'll take all the restraints away, do what you wish to him, don't kill him. And so Job goes through misery. He loses part of his family, he loses his business, he's physically attacked, and he's just a wreck. And his friends come and they debate for most of the book of Job, why am I going through this? Why is there suffering like this? His friends say, it must be your fault, Job. And he's going, no, it's not. I wish I had God here. I'd sure put him on the spot. Well, toward the end, Job 38, God shows up. And here's what happens. Job's been asking all through the book, why am I going through this? So God says to him, verse 2, who is this that darkens counsel by words without knowledge? Dress for action like a man. I'll question you, and you make it known to me. Where were you when I laid the foundation of the earth? Tell me, if you have understanding. Who determined its measurements? Surely you know. Boy, is that sarcasm, huh? Or who stretched the line upon it? On what were its bases sunk? Or who laid its cornerstone when the morning stars sang together and all the sons of God shouted for joy? So Job is presented with questions. God does not answer him. God does not say, look, Job, let's sit down, let's go through it. I'll do a little chalk talk up here, and I'll tell you why you're going through this, and I'll tell you why everybody's going through suffering and problems. That's not what God does. Do you notice that? God asks him questions that are basically saying, I know a zillion times more than you know, Job. And so he asks Job these questions. Job can't answer any of these questions. And so do you see there's a philosophical idea out there that who are we to say, if I don't understand a reason for pain and suffering, there must not be any. Because I have the greatest mind possible for looking at pain and suffering. That's not the case, is it? We are so limited in our knowledge. It's like looking at the world through a really tiny little lens. We're not going to see very much. God sees everything. We see this little tiny thing. And so for us to say, I don't get it. I don't understand pain and suffering, so therefore there must not be a God. That suggests that somehow we're supposed to have answers to everything. And Job finds out, I don't know. I don't have all the answers. God really challenged him. In fact, Job ends up saying this, surely I spoke of things I did not understand. Wouldn't that be a good comment for a lot of us? I know I often speak on things I don't really understand. I'd be better off if I'd keep my mouth shut. My ears had heard of you, but now my eyes have seen you. Therefore I despise myself and repent in dust and ashes. Job says, what in the world was I thinking? I'm looking for answers from an omniscient God that created the universe, who is spirit, who exists someplace else, who has brought everything into existence, brought me into existence, who understands the past, the present, the future. And I think he's going to be able to explain all this to me? What was going through my head? How crazy is that? I spoke of things I did not understand. And we do the same thing. Here's another explanation. Again, philosophical explanation for the problem of evil. It goes back to Genesis. You probably can't see this very well, but I love this picture. On the right side is sunlight and beautiful trees, and then, I don't know if you can see some rays coming out here. The light is coming out into this, but it's all darkness in here. And down here are two small figures walking away from that light. This is supposed to represent the fall of man. So you've got this wonderful, just beautiful location that people have walked away from, and they're walking into darkness. Isn't that part of the problem of the fall? The human race turned its back on God, and God said, all right, you want to go your own way, go your own way. And what have we done? We've suffered ever since. We said, thanks, we'll take care of the wheel of life, and we've crashed the car. So both the human race and nature's been affected. We have disturbed nature because of our fall. So it says in the New Testament that nature is groaning. The world is groaning. So a lot of this pain and suffering is back to what we did in the Garden of Eden. More philosophical answers. Look at Romans 5. What is it talking about there? That actually, when we go through an episode of pain or suffering, that it actually is a good character building experience. And here's what Paul says. We also rejoice in our sufferings. Wow. Really? We're supposed to rejoice in our sufferings? Because why? We know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance character, and character hope. I want you to think for just a minute. I love that sequence. So we go through suffering. It produces, if we're on target with God and we've got our life figured out, we understand we want to put God first, and we know we're going to go through pain and suffering, it produces perseverance. We hang in there. We keep walking with God. In fact, I'm going to mention a book later by Tim Keller. It's called Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering. So we walk with God. We persevere. We continue. And as we continue, it changes our character. Maybe we become more soft-hearted toward other people. Maybe we discover some inner strength that we didn't have. Maybe it builds up our prayer life. Maybe we connect better with our spouse. Maybe we get more involved in church activities. Whatever it is, we become different people. As we become different people, our character changes. Do you see what it does next? It produces hope in us. It produces that feeling that God got me through that. He will get me through other things. We hope in the goodness of God. We trust in the goodness of God. So it's a character building situation. Well, what about accidents? We have planes that crash. We have trains that derail. We have car accidents that claim 30,000, 40,000 Americans a year. All these terrible accidents. Is there any rhyme or reason to that? Well, airplanes. What do they have in the front and the back? They have these things called black boxes. So when a plane crashes, these boxes, at least you hope, they survive. And if they do, what do? They take them and they meticulously go through all the procedures of what happened as the airplane is analyzed, the pilots are analyzed, the flight path is analyzed. And you think about, what's the opposite here? What if God prevented all airplane crashes? What if He prevented all car accidents, all ship disasters? He could, couldn't He? I think what would happen, and others feel this way too, if God stopped all these things, we would become pretty sloppy individuals. Does that make sense? We wouldn't try to create a safe car. God will take care of us. We wouldn't care if the wings fell off the airplane. God will take care of us. We wouldn't put in safety features into anything. God will take care of us. And we would turn into little babies. God wants us to care for ourselves and care for our neighbors. And part of that means you go through accident results and you make things better, you make things safer. Good heavens, are airplanes safer today than they used to be? Thousands of times safer. Are cars better? They have backup cameras. They have all sorts of systems that will help you lane changing. They have systems that let you know if you're getting too close to somebody in front of you. Airbags, a better construction so the car has the ability to withstand a roll or a head-on collision. They didn't used to have these kinds of things. Here's something else that we get. Again, philosophical situations. So evil and suffering comes along. What do we do as a result? It gives us a chance to improve the world. Several places in the New Testament, God talks about things we can do that are good deeds. We can help alleviate pain. We can help alleviate suffering. That's what we're supposed to do. We're supposed to look and see who's suffering and take care of those people. Help the widows. Help the poor. But I wanted to contrast something here just a minute. I want you to think about the Muslim approach. Very different. It's very deterministic. God is going to do what God is going to do, and it doesn't matter what you do. In fact, you end up basically full of resignation. You just say, Allah wills it. It's just up to Allah. And you get a disconnect from the world, from making things better. I'll give you an example here. Here's a Muslim creed. It is he who causes harm and good. The good works of some and the evil of others are signs that God wishes to punish some and reward others. So if a car crashes, it's the person's fault. Allah is just doing a number on that individual. There's a story that in a Muslim country, there was an inadequate railing or a missing railing, I can't remember which, on an upper floor of an apartment complex, and little kids would mess around playing with an animal or something and then slip and go over the edge and either get hurt badly or die. But they didn't fix the railing because it was just a sign that God wanted to punish some people and reward others. God willed it. What are you going to do? Well, what we would do in the West is get that railing up there. Make it child-proof. Make that child safe. So that's something else we may do as a result of pain and suffering. We go out and we make the world a better place. Still talking about philosophical responses to the problem of evil. It's called the free will defense. And this is usually the number one thing people think of when they think of trying to defend against the charge that God's out there, but there's evil. How can that be? Well, God doesn't want us to be, as you can see here, He doesn't want us to be robots. He doesn't want us to be a puppet that He's controlling all the time. Otherwise, He could make us good, couldn't He? He could make us do the right thing every single time. No adultery, no sin of any kind, no cheating, no murders. Every time we took a gun, our hand froze. Then God could do that. Yes, He's got ultimate power. But what kind of world would that look like? Would we become robotic? He would have to remove free will. And apparently, and again, we don't get the big picture. We don't get God's picture. But apparently, to God, free will is so vital, it's so important, that He's willing to turn us loose. And sometimes we use free will very well, and sometimes we use it terribly. And we hurt others. We hurt ourselves. But God's big picture, it seems that free will is hugely important. You ever thought about this? You ever had somebody say to you, God, why don't you get rid of evil? Well, a good answer to that would be, a good question, if He did, at midnight, I want God to get rid of evil, where would we be at 12:01? I bet it wouldn't even take most of us 1 minute to already start committing sins. Sins of omission and sins of commission. That's the human race. So we might want to be a little careful if we ask God to get rid of evil, because we always think evil is out there. We never think it's here. Evil's in us. We're part of the problem. What about natural disasters? This is a picture taken from a building for the 1906 earthquake in San Francisco. And you can see the devastation. The earthquake did plenty of damage, but it was the fire afterwards that swept through the area. Those buildings weren't built that well, and there wasn't much defense against fire. And so you're looking down the street of just utter devastation. So what's the answer to that? Why would God allow that? Well, this world has certain physical parameters that have to operate if you're going to have life here at all. I'll give you one example. You have to have plate tectonics. You have to have chunks of the earth banging into each other, because it allows the replenishing of nutrients and all sorts of stuff that I don't fully understand. But you got to have plate tectonics. You have a world that doesn't have plate tectonics, you don't get life. So, you got plate tectonics. The problem is, once in a while, those plates jump. They mash up against each other and then one skids. And when they skid, you get something like this. Tsunamis, volcanoes, avalanches, whatever it is, you have to have them to have life. And then we go and build along the seashore, we build along fault lines, and we end up with devastation like this. Let's talk about emotional answers now. So we've been doing philosophical answers. Let's move to emotional answers. So once more, what we're talking about here is, we could talk those philosophy questions till all the cows come home. That would be easy to do. But we don't do it if we're in the middle of pain and suffering ourselves or if our friends are. Those answers don't satisfy like the emotional answers do. So let's talk for a few minutes about emotional responses when somebody is suffering. What's one good thing about pain and suffering? It teaches us humility. Let me read you from 2 Corinthians 12. Here's Paul talking. To keep me from becoming conceited, there was given me a thorn in my flesh. By the way, people don't really know what it is. In one place he says he wrote his name very largely for people to look at. It might have been an eye problem. Anyway, there was given him a thorn in his flesh. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away from me. But he said to me, my grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. Don't we always want to be in charge? Don't we always want things to go well for us because we've got life all figured out? I know in 3 months I want to do this, in 6 months here, and I'm going to get this money, and I'm going to buy this, and we got all these things all worked out, and then pain and suffering hit us. Some disaster that we didn't expect. Bam! We get knocked sideways. It's a hard lesson, but it's a lesson of humility. And Paul learned that. He learned that I am not in control. The steering wheel gets taken away from me. And God says, my power is going to be shown better through your weakness. Makes sense. Doesn't make it a lot of fun, but it certainly makes sense. Keeping us humble. Tough job considering pride is part of the human race. Another Christian answer. Pain and suffering helps us reach out to other people. 2 Corinthians chapter 1. Praise be to the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who comforts us in all our troubles so that we can comfort those in any trouble with the comfort we ourselves have received from God. Makes sense, doesn't it? I don't know about you, but I am a far more compassionate person if I've gone through something that I see somebody else going through. I was dealing with a psychological issue a while back, and my sister-in-law had another psychological issue that I used to think was just a weakness of hers, and I thought, well, why don't you just go suck it up and get things done? And then I went through something that I couldn't suck it up and get things done. Oh, I tell you, I'm a lot more compassionate now in that area than I used to be. So, if we go through pain and suffering, we're far more likely to have our arms out to help others that are going through things like that. That makes sense. Here's another Christian answer. This one comes from C.S. Lewis. I love C.S. Lewis. He wrote Mere Christianity, other books on apologetics, Christian defense of the faith. He wrote the series of the Chronicles of Narnia, the fantasy stories that tell the story of Jesus, especially the first one, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. He wrote a science fiction trilogy called Out of the Silent Planet, Paralandra, and That Hideous Strength. That's probably his most forgotten books these days, but those are good too because I like science fiction. Well, here's what he was saying, talking about pain and suffering. He says, when we go through something, it's acting as if God has a microphone or a megaphone and he's trying to reach us. So here's what he says. God whispers to us in our pleasures, speaks in our conscience, but shouts in our pains. It's his megaphone to rouse a deaf world. In other words, what? We're going along fine. We've got our life all figured out, and then something comes along and just smashes us, and God is saying, are you aware now that you don't control your life? Can you see that I'm out here? Can you see that I care for you? Can you see that this is the time you ought to turn to me? I'm afraid that's me in many situations. I turn to God when I'm more in trouble than if everything's going fine. So pain and suffering actually arouses us to the fact that there's a God that would like to interact with us if we would reach out to Him. Some more answers. Again, these are the emotional answers. When we get pain and suffering, what might it do? It would encourage us to have a relationship with a God who has wounds. We serve the only God who has come in this world and suffered and bled and died for us so that we know we can have a connection with Him. This is the way Tim Keller put it. By the way, another one of my all-time favorite authors is Tim Keller, pastor of a church back in New York. People told him it's a crazy idea to set up a church in New York City. There's just a bunch of pagans there. Nobody cares about church. Well, he set his church up and it's huge. It's very successful. He's planting churches all over the place. He's written some powerful, powerful books. One of his, it's an apologetics book, is really good. It's called The Reason for God. Pick up a copy sometime. It's an excellent read. It's really good if you have a friend who's not really a believer, kind of interested. This book would go a long way toward opening his or her eyes. But here's what Tim Keller said. We do not know the reason God allows evil and suffering to continue. I think that's true. I'm giving you a bunch of reasons today. These are just my best guesses and other people's best guesses. But we really don't know why God is allowing this. So we don't know. Or why it's so random. We're okay, but our neighbor suffers. Or our neighbor suffers and somebody else suffers who's a very nice person. And we look at that and we say, I don't get it. It seems just like you threw the dice. Tim Keller goes on though. But now at least we know what the reason is not. It cannot be that He does not love us. It cannot be that He does not care. You see what he's saying? We go through something awful and we say, God, why am I going through it? Why are my children going through this? Why is my wife going through this? Why are my friends going through this? And we don't know. But he says, we do know this. It's not because He doesn't like us. It's not because He doesn't care about us. He has demonstrated His love for us. He brought His own Son into this world. He lived a life that was beautiful, suffered a death that was terrible, and came back in all power and glory with the resurrection. But He obviously cares to give Himself to this world, to be part of the dirt and the pain and the suffering in this life. If we suffer, it's not because He is callous toward us. We're His children. He cares about us. Here's another response. Again, we're just doing the emotional responses right now. We are guaranteed something awfully special as we go through tough times. We are guaranteed the Holy Spirit, the third person of the Trinity. Romans 8 says this, For you did not receive a spirit that makes you a slave again to fear, but you received the spirit of sonship. You're actually being grafted into His family. And by Him we cry, Abba, means daddy. We cry, Abba, daddy, Father. The Spirit Himself testifies with our spirit that we're God's children. The Spirit helps us in our weakness. So that Spirit is a spirit of comfort. That Spirit is a spirit of connecting us to God's Word. That Spirit connects us to God. He gives us this. This is a supernatural power that we are given, a supernatural comforter. Jesus called Him the Comforter. Here's another Christian answer. Remember when we talked about that little girl lying there on a bed, suffering? What can we say? The atheist looks and says, sorry, tough luck. You threw the dice, it didn't work out for you. Look to the parents, you say, well, hope you have more kids, give her a hug. This is the last time you're going to see her. What is the Christian response? There's a future life after this one. This pain and suffering is going to be gone like that. It's going to be a blink of the eye. And then we're going to live eternally, Jesus says, with Him in a paradise beyond anything we can imagine. 1 Corinthians 2:9 says this. I like that image, by the way. No eye has seen, no ear has heard, no mind has conceived what God has prepared for those who love Him. That's quite a promise. In other words, you ain't seen nothing yet. You can't even begin to imagine what it'll be like. That little girl is going to be whole and healthy. The family will be reunited with her again. It's going to be a world beyond any kind of comprehension. Some final thoughts. This man is G.K. Chesterton. He lived around 1900. When he was at the height of his fame as a writer, apparently a newspaper had sent a note out to a bunch of leading thinkers of the time period to ask them, what's wrong with the world? In other words, where is this evil? Maybe we can roll up our shirt sleeves and tackle this. So some people say, well, the problem is education. Okay, so that's the evil, that's the problem, let's fix it. Some people said it's the economic system. Okay, so we'll work on that. Others said it's the politics. Okay. But Chesterton sent in a very short response. The question was, what's wrong with the world? Chesterton said, I am. So we're back to that issue again. It's very easy for us to say, come on, God, take care of the evil that's in the world, that person and that situation and that government. But the finger is always going like this, when it really ought to be going like this. We're the problem. We need to take care of ourselves, don't we? We have enough evil to deal with within our own lives. Here's another final thought. I'm just putting several of these together here. In a sense, pain and suffering makes people want to come up with a quick answer. And so on a piece of paper, they scratch out some ideas. Well, if we just did this, if our government looked like this, if we would just spend more money in education, if we would just work in this area. And we get these visions of these utopias, these perfect worlds. And we've had writers doing utopias for centuries. And they say, it'll be glorious. We just need to change a little bit. And so you get a state like this. This was a parade in North Korea. And they're set up as a utopia. This is supposed to be a worker's paradise. Well, how's that worked out for the people of Korea, North Korea? Is that a paradise? No. There is no such thing. This is something we find out. There's no such cure for the problems to try to set up a utopia here on earth, because you're dealing with humans that have a brokenness, and you're not going to be able to fix this that way. I don't know how many places around the world have tried these utopian ideas. They get together and there's great excitement and it falls apart. So we've got to keep that in mind. Let's be clear-headed. We're not going to get a utopia here on earth. We're not going to get a political party in power and they're going to solve all the problems. The problems are going to continue. Here's another final thought. We need to reach out and help others, and thank goodness there are organizations that will do that. I just put 2 on the board here. You can probably think of another dozen that do some really good work. One is Open Doors. That symbol is interesting, isn't it? It looks like that ichthus, that fish symbol, except the ichthus part up at the top, the fish, it's turned into a piece of barbed wire. And so Open Doors works especially with Christians that are persecuted all over the world. Christians who are imprisoned, Christians who are under house arrest, and it's a terrific organization that you can write letters to support these people and get Bibles into hands of people that want them, and the government's been very restrictive around the world. Great organization. Another one is World Vision. They've been around a long, long time. They'll take your money and support a young child for a few years until they get to be an adult. They have education programs, and they're doing some good things around the world. And like I said, I'm not saying these are the only 2. There are plenty of good organizations, but we need to help others. And we can. It's easy. They're out there. They're available for us to use. 2 other things maybe we should be focusing on. This is what Tim Keller said. We should be practicing our response to pain and suffering. We should be bringing some disciplines into our life before we face pain and suffering. That's a terrible time to start saying, okay, let's see, I'm in the middle of a terrible mess. What were those things that will help me deal with it? That's a little late. Better we start now with a good prayer life, with Bible reading, for thinking of the good things that God has done for us, whatever it is. Get ourselves prepared. It's not a question of if we go through pain and suffering, it's when. You know that. It's when. So we ought to be ready. We should remember God's goodness. He has done so much for us. If we keep a list, we could actually physically write these things out. We could certainly run them through our heads. If we remember the things God has done in our lives to bless us, maybe it's health, maybe it's money, maybe it's family, maybe it's location, maybe it's a job, maybe it's intellect, maybe it's sense of humor, maybe it's a powerful prayer life that you have. Whatever it is, God has blessed us over and over and over. We're in the United States, for heaven's sakes. Are we blessed to be in this country? Yes, we can meet without persecution. We have freedom of speech. We have freedom of religion, freedom of assembly. We can do so many things. God has blessed us no end. It's an amazing thing if we really sit down and think about the things He's done for us. I think I'm going to skip this part here, but I know you would have a long list of the good things that God has given you. Let's talk about a few books that you might find useful for you. I mentioned Tim Keller several times. I'm going to mention him again before we're out of here. But he's got that book, Walking with God Through Pain and Suffering. I think it's the single best book that you might want to have. Powerful book. The other one that you might think about is called The Case for Faith. There's one chapter in there. In fact, I'm going to read a little section from that. It's by Lee Strobel, one of his many successful books. He started out with a book called The Case for Christ. Sold I don't know how many copies, but he's an investigative journalist, and so he goes out and he talks to people who have Christian responses and asks them hard questions. And he's got a chapter. How can you believe in a God when there's so much pain and suffering in this world? That's a good chapter. But he's got other chapters on other issues that you might find useful too. Two more books. One's by Phil Yancey. I recommend Phil Yancey big time. I like his material. And he's got a book, love the title, Where's God When It Hurts? We know God's there and we're happy with Him when the sun shines down on us, but all of a sudden when we go through something, where did God go? What's He doing at that time? And then Os Guinness, another powerful writer, has a book called Unspeakable. And then the small print, I don't know if you can see that, says, Facing Up to Evil in an Age of Genocide and Terror. Yeah, unfortunately, that's the kind of world we're in. Back to Tim Keller. I love this insight of his. People who haven't suffered much are often shallow, unacquainted with both their weaknesses and strengths, naive about human nature and life, and almost always fragile and unresilient. I think that's true. Do you? Do you agree with me on that? Let me read that again. That's just so strong. People who haven't suffered much are often shallow. They're unacquainted with their strengths and weaknesses. They really don't know what they're capable of. They're naive about human nature. They don't get it. And they're almost always fragile and unresilient. You want to be resilient. Life hits you hard. Time and time again, you want to be able to come back from that and be ready to take on the next challenge. Okay. This is I promise, this is the last part of Tim Keller, but it's just too good. So this is a double slide here. He says, think of 4 things that we want. Do you want to know who you are? Your strengths and weaknesses? Do you want to be a compassionate person who skillfully helps people who are hurting? Do you want to have such a profound trust in God that you're fortified against the disappointments in life? Do you want simply to be wise about how life goes on? Those are 4 crucial things to have. Ooh, and then look what he says. But none of them are readily achievable without suffering. Oh, I would like all those things, wouldn't you? Do you want to know more about yourself? Of course you do. Do you want to be able to help others who are suffering? Sure. Do you want to trust God more? Who doesn't? Do you want to just be wise? Do you want to be intelligent enough that your kids come to you and your friends come to you and your coworkers come to you because you have this wisdom about life? He says, The only way you get those four things is what? You go through suffering. Oh, it's a hard lesson. Here's the rest of his quote. There's no way to know who you really are until you're tested. There's no way to really empathize and sympathize with others who are suffering, he says, unless you've suffered yourself. There's no way to really learn how to trust in God unless and until you're drowning. So you can say, I trust God. Well, it's easy to say that when you have your job, you have your health, you have enough money, you have a home, you have your family. You have all these good things. But start taking those things away. Do you really trust God? Let me tell you just real quickly a part of a story here. This is in the Case for Faith that I mentioned before. Lee Strobel tells a horrific story of a father who, with his family, they were trying to get him into the house one night. They'd been in the car, and one of the kids was behind the car, and they didn't know it, and they backed the car up to do something, and they ran over and killed their child. And this man, his name is Mark, actually held his dying child. And he says it was horribly painful. He's not saying it was a great thing to go through. He said it was horribly painful. And he was a pastor. And eventually he got back to the pulpit. And he said he drew on his own experiences with God in the depths of sorrow. People were captivated because his own loss had given him special insights, empathy, and credibility. Remember, that's some of the things we've been saying. In the end, dozens of them responded by saying they too wanted to know this Jesus, this God of tears. Now other hearts were being healed because of Mark's having been broken. From one couple's despair emerges new hope for many. And this is what Mark says. These are the words coming from the man who had to cradle his dying child. Sometimes skeptics scoff at the Bible, saying that God can cause good to emerge from our pain if we run toward Him instead of away from Him. But I've watched it happen in my own life. I've experienced God's goodness through deep pain, and no skeptic can dispute that. The God who the skeptic denies is the same God who held our hands in the deep, dark places, who strengthened our marriage, who deepened our faith, who increased our reliance on Him, who gave us 2 more children, and who infused our lives with new purpose and meaning so that we can make a difference to others. What a remarkable testimony. He went through it all. He would not want to go through it again. And he's saying it was awful. He's not whistling and saying what a wonderful experience. But look at the things that came out of that were powerful. So let me end with this. This is what Jesus said. Yes, we're going to have suffering. But He says, peace, I leave with you. Do not be afraid. We've got to get the big picture here. Jesus says, I have overcome the world. We're on the winning team. We are victorious. It'll be dark for a while. There will be pain. There will be suffering. But there's joy at the end because we are victors in Him. So that's my challenge. That's my prayer for you, to stick with it. God is in charge. Jesus has triumphed over the grave. We have a future after this life. The pain and suffering is momentary. The joy will be eternal. And we need that perspective. And God grant that He give us that perspective, to have joy in the middle of trouble and to be a beacon to others who maybe are lost and confused and hurting, and we can be there for them. Thank you so much.